For most of modern history, economic thinking treated population as a blunt instrument. More people meant more workers, more consumers, more growth. Fewer people meant stagnation. That intuition worked roughly. When birth rates were high, mortality was falling, and age structures were pyramid-shaped, with many young people supporting a small elderly population. That world no longer exists. What matters now is not how many people a country has, but who those people are, how old they are, how healthy they are, and how productively they can convert time, energy, and knowledge into economic output. Demographics, in this sense, function like a slow-moving engine beneath the economy. It does not rev quickly, and it does not respond well to short-term policy changes. But once its direction is set, it exerts an almost gravitational pull on growth, debt, innovation, and social stability. At the core of this engine is the dependency ratio, the balance between those who produce economic value and those who depend on it. Children and retirees do not vanish from the economy, of course, but they consume far more than they produce in formal market terms. When a large working-age population supports relatively few dependents, societies experience what economists call a demographic dividend. Labor is abundant, wages are competitive, tax bases grow, and governments can invest in infrastructure, education, and innovation. As populations age, this dividend reverses. The working population shrinks or stagnates, while healthcare costs rise, pension systems strain, and public budgets tilt toward maintenance rather than expansion. Growth slows, not because people are less capable, but because fewer of them are positioned to generate net surplus. This shift is already visible across much of the world. Fertility rates have fallen below replacement level in most developed economies and in a growing number of developing ones. Life expectancy, while unevenly distributed, has increased dramatically over the past century. The result is a structural inversion, fewer young workers entering the labor force just as large cohorts move into retirement. From an economic perspective, this creates three compounding pressures. First, labor scarcity. When working-age populations shrink, economies must choose between accepting lower growth, importing labor through migration, or increasing productivity per worker. Each option carries political, cultural, and technological constraints. Second, capital reallocation. Aging societies tend to save more and spend less. Consumption patterns shift away from housing, durable goods, and education toward healthcare, financial services, and basic necessities. This alters investment incentives and can dampen entrepreneurial risk-taking. Third, fiscal imbalance. Pay-as-you-go systems, pensions, healthcare, social insurance were designed for demographic pyramids, not columns or inverted triangles. Without structural reform, governments face rising debt or politically painful benefit reductions. Technology enters this picture not as a simple solution, but as a force multiplier. Automation, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms can, in theory, offset labor shortages by increasing output per worker. A smaller workforce can support a larger dependent population if productivity gains are real, widely distributed, and economically accessible. But technology also introduces new demographic feedback loops. High-skilled workers benefit disproportionately from technological leverage, while lower-skilled roles are often compressed or eliminated. This can suppress fertility further, as economic insecurity delays family formation. At the same time, longer lifespans enabled by medical technology extend the duration of dependency unless retirement norms and labor participation adapt. In other words, demographics shape how technology is used, and technology reshapes demographic behavior. Neither operates in isolation. This documentary will explore how these forces interact across different regions of the world. Some societies are aging rapidly before they become wealthy. Others retain young populations but struggle to convert them into productive labor. A few sit at the crossroads, racing to automate before demographic momentum turns against them. In the segments ahead, we will move country by country and system by system, examining how population structure quietly rewrites economic destiny and whether technology can bend that trajectory or merely slow its descent. The demographic engine is already running. The only remaining question is whether we understand where it's taking us. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. See cookie preferences. Aging is often framed as a triumph. Longer lives signal medical progress, rising living standards, and the partial defeat of diseases that once defined human limits. From a human perspective, this is unquestionably true. From an economic perspective, however, longevity introduces a set of structural stresses that no modern economy has fully solved. The central challenge is not that people are living longer, but that economic systems were designed for shorter lives. Most pension systems, retirement ages, career paths, and savings models assume a relatively brief post-work period. When these systems were established in the mid-20th century, retirement often lasted 10 to 15 years. Today, in many countries, it can span 25 or even 30 years. That extra time must be financed by individuals, by governments, or by future workers who may themselves be fewer in number. This creates a mathematical imbalance. As fertility declines and life expectancy rises, each working-age individual is implicitly responsible for supporting a larger share of retirees. Even if productivity improves, the transfer burden increases unless participation rates change. One common response is to raise the retirement age. On paper, this appears rational. Healthier, longer-lived populations should work longer. In practice, this is unevenly feasible. Knowledge workers and professionals can often extend their careers with minimal physical strain. Manual laborers and service workers, whose bodies bear the cumulative cost of decades of work, face diminishing capacity long before official retirement thresholds. The result is political resistance and widening inequality between occupational classes. Healthcare costs compound the issue. Medical spending rises sharply with age, particularly in the final decades of life. Technological advances, while improving outcomes, often increase costs by expanding what is medically possible rather than reducing per-patient expenditure. Aging societies thus experience cost inflation without proportional productivity gains, a mismatch that strains both public budgets and private insurance systems. There's also a macroeconomic effect that unfolds slowly but powerfully: demand stagnation. Older populations consume less overall, especially in categories that drive growth: housing, consumer durables, new businesses. They are more likely to prioritize savings and financial stability over risk. This shifts economies toward preservation rather than expansion, reducing the velocity of money and dampening innovation. Technology is often proposed as a counterweight. Robotics can assist in elder care, reducing labor shortages. AI-driven diagnostics can improve efficiency in healthcare delivery. Remote work and digital tools can extend productive careers. These are real and meaningful contributions, but they do not eliminate the underlying arithmetic. Technology can stretch capacity, but it cannot fully erase the economic weight of large, non-working populations unless social norms and labor participation fundamentally change. Some countries are experimenting with partial solutions: phased retirement, lifelong reskilling, and incentives for older workers to remain economically active in reduced roles. Others are betting on automation to compensate for shrinking labor pools. A few rely heavily on immigration, effectively importing younger demographics to stabilize their systems. Each approach carries trade-offs. Immigration can rebalance age structures but introduces political and social friction. Automation boosts output but concentrates income and may further suppress birth rates. Extending working lives improves fiscal balance but risks eroding quality of life and social cohesion. The deeper reality is this: aging transforms economies from engines of growth into systems of resource allocation under constraint. Success is no longer measured by expansion but by stability, by whether societies can maintain living standards without exhausting future generations. In the next segment, we'll turn to the other side of the demographic spectrum: regions where populations remain young, growing, and restless, and why youth, without economic absorption, can become as destabilizing as age. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. See cookie preferences. While much of the developed world is grappling with aging and contraction, large portions of the global population are experiencing the opposite condition: youth-heavy demographics where the majority of citizens are under 30. On paper, this appears to be a mirror image of aging societies, a vast reserve of potential labor, creativity, and growth. In practice, youthful populations create their own economic pressures, especially when institutions fail to absorb them productively. Demography alone does not generate prosperity. It only creates possibility. The key variable in young societies is not birth rate, but labor market absorption, the ability of an economy to provide stable, productive employment for large cohorts entering adulthood each year. When job creation lags population growth, unemployment and underemployment rise, often masked by informal work that offers little security or long-term advancement. This produces a paradox. Youthful societies can exhibit high headline growth rates while simultaneously experiencing widespread economic frustration. GDP expands, but per capita gains remain thin. Infrastructure strains under rapid urbanization. Education systems scale faster than quality control allows. Credentials proliferate while meaningful opportunities do not. Economically, this results in what can be called compressed opportunity. Too many people compete for too few high-productivity roles, driving wages down and delaying household formation. Fertility may remain high for cultural reasons, but investment per child often falls, reinforcing cycles of low productivity. Politically, the consequences are even sharper. Young populations are statistically more prone to protest, migration, and social volatility, not because youth is inherently unstable, but because expectations rise faster than economic reality. Access to global media and digital platforms intensifies this effect, making local stagnation feel like personal failure rather than structural limitation. Technology plays a double-edged role here. On one hand, digital tools dramatically lower barriers to entry for entrepreneurship, remote work, and informal commerce. A young person with connectivity can access global markets, learn advanced skills, and participate in economic activity that was previously inaccessible. This has real, measurable benefits. On the other hand, technology also compresses labor demand. Automation and platform efficiency reduce the number of workers needed per unit of output. Entry-level jobs, historically the bridge between youth and productivity, are often the first to disappear. When combined with large youth cohorts, this creates a bottleneck where millions are technically educated but economically idle. Migration becomes the pressure release valve. Young workers move toward aging economies, seeking higher wages and stability. This can benefit both sides in theory, but in practice it creates distributional conflicts, political backlash, and brain drain from origin countries. The sending economies lose human capital just as they need it most, while receiving economies struggle to integrate newcomers into already strained systems. There is also a timing problem. Demographic windows do not stay open indefinitely. Youthful populations age whether or not economies are ready. If productive capacity does not scale quickly enough, countries can miss their demographic dividend entirely, transitioning from youth-heavy to aging without ever achieving sustained prosperity. The most successful cases share common traits: heavy investment in basic education quality, rapid infrastructure build-out, export-oriented growth strategies, and institutional stability that encourages long-term capital formation. Where these elements are absent, youth becomes a source of pressure rather than progress. In the next segment, we will examine what happens when populations stop growing altogether, when fertility falls below replacement and demographic decline becomes a structural feature rather than a temporary phase. When fertility falls below replacement level, roughly 2.1 births per woman in most societies, it signals a quiet but profound transition. Population decline does not arrive as a sudden collapse. It unfolds gradually, almost invisibly at first, until its economic effects become impossible to ignore. Unlike aging, which increases dependency, demographic decline reduces scale itself. Fewer births today mean fewer workers, consumers, taxpayers, and innovators decades from now. Entire economic systems, from housing markets to transportation networks, are built on assumptions of steady or growing population. When those assumptions fail, inefficiencies accumulate across the system. One of the earliest impacts appears in labor markets. Entry-level labor shrinks, competition for workers increases, and wage pressures rise, not necessarily because productivity improves, but because scarcity demands it. While this can benefit some workers in the short term, it often accelerates automation and outsourcing, reducing the number of jobs available and reinforcing the decline. At the same time, consumption patterns contract. Fewer households form. Demand for new housing weakens. Large, capital-intensive sectors that rely on scale, construction, retail, transportation, struggle to maintain profitability. This creates a deflationary bias. Prices stagnate or fall, discouraging investment and slowing economic velocity. Public finance becomes increasingly fragile. Tax bases shrink while age-related expenditures grow. Governments face a narrowing corridor of options: raise taxes on a smaller workforce, reduce benefits to politically powerful older populations, or accumulate debt that shifts the burden forward. None of these paths are painless, and all tend to reinforce social tension. Technology is often presented as the escape hatch. Automation allows fewer workers to produce more output. AI systems can sustain services with minimal human input. In theory, a smaller population can enjoy the same or higher living standards if productivity rises fast enough. But productivity gains must outpace demographic contraction, not merely offset it. In many declining societies, this does not occur. Technological investment concentrates in specific sectors, while the broader economy remains structurally undersized. Infrastructure built for larger populations becomes expensive to maintain, and underutilization increases per capita costs. There is also a behavioral dimension. Low fertility is rarely reversed by policy incentives alone. Financial bonuses, tax credits, and parental benefits help at the margins, but they do not fundamentally change the economic calculus facing young adults. High housing costs, job insecurity, and long working hours discourage family formation, especially in technologically advanced, urbanized economies. Once decline sets in, it tends to self-reinforce. Fewer children mean fewer future parents. Social norms adjust to smaller families. Educational and childcare infrastructure contracts, making parenting harder rather than easier. What begins as a choice becomes a structural condition. Some societies attempt to substitute births with immigration. This can stabilize population numbers, but it does not eliminate aging and introduces integration challenges that scale with speed and volume. Others accept decline and attempt to manage it gracefully, prioritizing quality of life over growth. The deeper shift is conceptual. Economies accustomed to expansion must learn to function under contraction. Success is no longer measured by GDP growth alone, but by resilience, by whether systems can shrink without breaking. In the next segment, we will explore how technology reshapes this equation more directly, altering not just how many people an economy has, but how many it actually needs. For most of economic history, population growth and economic growth were tightly linked. More people meant more labor, and more labor meant more output. Technology improved productivity, but it rarely eliminated the need for human participation at scale. That relationship is now breaking down. Automation and artificial intelligence introduce a structural shift. Economic output is increasingly decoupled from human labor quantity. This matters profoundly in a demographic context. Aging and declining populations were once assumed to guarantee labor shortages and economic stagnation. Today, those shortages can be partially neutralized by machines that work continuously, scale instantly, and do not age. In certain sectors, the limiting factor is no longer workforce size, but capital availability and energy supply. Manufacturing illustrates this clearly. Modern factories produce more output with a fraction of the workforce required a generation ago. Robotics handle precision, endurance, and consistency better than humans, while AI systems optimize logistics, quality control, and maintenance. Similar dynamics are spreading into services, customer support, accounting, diagnostics, translation, and even elements of software development. From a purely technical standpoint, this suggests a future in which fewer workers can support larger populations, easing demographic pressure. But the economic reality is more complex. Automation does not eliminate labor evenly. It disproportionately replaces routine and mid-skill roles while amplifying the productivity of high-skill workers. This creates a polarized labor market. A small number of highly leveraged individuals generate enormous value, while a growing share of the population struggles to find stable, well-compensated work. In aging societies, this polarization compounds demographic stress. Retirees depend on the tax contributions of a shrinking workforce, but automation concentrates income in ways that are often poorly taxed or politically protected. The result is a paradox where productivity rises, yet fiscal capacity does not. In youthful societies, the effect is even sharper. Large cohorts entering the labor market encounter an economy that simply does not need them in traditional roles. Even when GDP grows, employment does not keep pace. This decoupling fuels underemployment, informality, and migration pressures. There is also a timing mismatch. Automation arrives fastest in capital-rich economies that are already aging, while labor-abundant economies struggle to adopt it at scale. This widens global inequality and reinforces demographic divergence between regions. Technology does offer adaptive possibilities. Human labor can shift toward roles that machines complement rather than replace. Caregiving, education, creative work, system oversight, and complex interpersonal services. AI can extend the productive capacity of older workers and enable lifelong skill adaptation. But these transitions require institutional support, education systems, labor protections, and income redistribution mechanisms that evolve as quickly as technology itself. Without such adaptation, automation risks transforming demographic challenges into structural unemployment rather than relief. Societies may find themselves with fewer workers needed, more dependents supported, and growing numbers of economically disengaged adults, an unstable configuration regardless of population size. The central question is no longer whether technology can offset demographic decline. It is whether economic systems can distribute the gains of automation widely enough to maintain social and fiscal cohesion. In the next segment, we will examine migration, the human counterbalance to demographic imbalance, and why it is both economically rational and politically volatile in a technologically accelerated world. When demographics and economics fall out of balance, migration emerges as the most immediate corrective force. Unlike fertility or aging, which unfold over decades, migration can reshape population structure within a single political cycle. From a purely economic perspective, it is an elegant solution. Labor moves from surplus regions to deficit regions, smoothing demographic mismatches and sustaining growth. In practice, migration is anything but simple. Aging economies need workers, especially in healthcare, construction, logistics, and services that cannot be fully automated. Younger, high-growth regions often have an excess of labor, but insufficient domestic demand to absorb it. Migration links these two conditions, increasing productivity on both sides. Remittances flow back to origin countries, supporting households and stabilizing currencies. Host economies expand their tax base and delay the fiscal impact of aging. Yet migration also functions as an economic shock, particularly when it occurs rapidly or at scale. Labor markets do not absorb new workers frictionlessly. Wages in certain sectors may stagnate or decline. Housing demand increases faster than supply, pushing prices upward. Public services face short-term strain, even if long-term fiscal contributions are positive. These transitional costs are highly visible, while long-term gains are diffuse and slower to materialize. Technology amplifies these dynamics. Digital connectivity allows migrants to remain culturally and economically tied to origin countries, reducing assimilation pressure but also slowing integration. Remote work creates new forms of virtual migration, where labor crosses borders without people moving at all. This benefits firms but weakens traditional immigration pathways that once supported social integration and tax collection. There is also a skill mismatch problem. Aging economies often need mid-skill labor, care workers, technicians, trades, while migration flows increasingly include either very high-skill professionals or low-skill workers with limited upward mobility. Automation further narrows the space for the middle, intensifying polarization. Politically, migration collides with identity, sovereignty, and social trust. Even when economically beneficial, rapid demographic change can destabilize political systems, fueling populism and institutional gridlock. This, in turn, undermines the very economic stability migration is meant to support. From a demographic standpoint, migration does not solve aging, it postpones it. Migrants themselves age. Unless migration accelerates continuously, dependency ratios eventually rise again. In some cases, host countries become reliant on perpetual inflows, turning migration from a stabilizer into a structural dependency. For origin countries, large-scale emigration creates its own risks. Brain drain weakens domestic institutions. Skilled workers leave faster than they can be replaced. Remittances support consumption but may reduce incentives for local investment and reform. Youthful societies export their demographic dividend instead of capturing it. Technology may soften these trade-offs. Better credential recognition, digital education, and cross-border tax coordination could improve labor matching and fiscal outcomes. AI-driven planning could help governments anticipate flows rather than react to them. But technology cannot neutralize the social dimension of demographic change. Migration is best understood not as a solution, but as a balancing mechanism, one that works only when institutions, housing, labor markets, and political systems are aligned. Without that alignment, it transfers demographic stress rather than resolving it. In the next segment, we'll step back and examine how all of these demographic forces, aging, youth bulges, decline, automation, and migration, reshape global economic power itself. Demographics do not just shape national economies, they quietly redraw the global balance of power. Over long horizons, population structure influences which countries innovate, which accumulate capital, and which struggle to sustain influence despite technological sophistication. For much of the late 20th century, economic power clustered in regions that combine large working-age populations with strong institutions. That alignment is now fragmenting. Some of the world's wealthiest economies are aging rapidly, while much of the population growth is occurring in regions with weaker capital markets, infrastructure gaps, and political instability. This divergence produces a structural tension. Economic output remains concentrated in aging societies, while demographic momentum shifts elsewhere. Aging high-income countries retain advantages in technology, finance, and institutional depth. They control intellectual property, dominate global capital flows, and host the firms that design and deploy advanced automation. However, their domestic markets increasingly stagnate and their fiscal systems grow fragile. Economic power becomes more brittle, highly productive, but less adaptable. Younger regions, by contrast, hold the long-term supply of human capital but struggle to convert it into geopolitical influence. Without sufficient productivity, large populations translate into consumption rather than leverage. In some cases, demographic pressure overwhelms governance capacity, limiting the ability to invest in education, infrastructure, and innovation at the necessary scale. Technology complicates this picture. Automation allows aging economies to retain output with fewer people, slowing relative decline. AI-driven productivity can preserve industrial dominance even as populations shrink. But this dominance becomes capital-intensive rather than labor-intensive, reducing the spillover benefits that once accompanied industrialization. Meanwhile, youthful economies face a narrowing path to catch up. Traditional development models, labor-intensive manufacturing, export-led growth, require global demand and access to capital. As aging societies consume less and automate more, the ladder that earlier developers climbed becomes harder to access. This alters trade dynamics. Instead of exchanging manufactured goods for labor, economies increasingly trade data, algorithms, energy, and intellectual property. Countries that lack digital infrastructure or stable institutions risk exclusion from high-value networks regardless of population size. There is also a security dimension. Aging societies may find it harder to sustain military capacity and strategic projection, even if technologically superior. Younger societies may possess manpower but lack the economic base to equip and maintain it. Power becomes asymmetric and situational rather than absolute. Over time, demographic divergence encourages fragmentation. Regional blocs form around compatible population structures and economic needs. Capital flows seek stability over growth. Migration corridors become strategic assets rather than humanitarian concerns. The result is a world where economic power is less about dominance and more about resilience, the ability to maintain complex systems under demographic constraint. Nations that align technology, migration, and social policy with their population realities will outperform those that cling to outdated growth assumptions. In the next segment, we will bring the focus inward, examining how households, wages, and inequality evolve as demographics and technology reshape everyday economic life. Demographic change is often discussed at the level of nations and global systems, but its most immediate effects are felt at the household level. Decisions about work, family formation, housing, and savings are where population structure translates into lived economic reality. As demographics shift, these micro-level choices aggregate into powerful macroeconomic outcomes. In aging and declining societies, household formation slows. People marry later, have fewer children, or none at all. This reduces demand for larger housing units and shifts spending toward individual consumption and services. Housing markets bifurcate. Desirable urban areas remain expensive due to limited supply and capital concentration, while peripheral regions experience long-term decline and asset depreciation. Wages respond unevenly. In theory, labor scarcity should drive wages higher. In practice, automation and global labor access cap gains for most workers. High-skill individuals who can leverage technology see outsized income growth, while mid-skill and routine workers experience stagnation. This divergence widens income inequality even as overall productivity rises. Demographics intensify this pattern. Older cohorts often hold significant asset wealth, property, equities, pensions, while younger workers face higher entry costs and weaker job security. Intergenerational inequality becomes more pronounced, not because of cultural conflict, but because of structural timing. Asset prices inflated during periods of growth collide with labor markets shaped by scarcity and automation. In youthful societies, the inequality dynamic is different but equally destabilizing. Large numbers of young adults compete for limited formal employment, suppressing wages at the bottom while rewarding those with access to education, networks, or capital. Informal economies expand, providing survival but limiting upward mobility. Household savings remain low, constraining domestic investment and reinforcing dependence on external capital. Technology reshapes households directly. Remote work decouples income from location for a subset of workers, increasing geographic inequality. AI-driven productivity tools allow individuals to generate income at scale, but only for those with the skills and access to deploy them. Digital platforms create winner-take-most markets where a small number of participants capture disproportionate value. Family economics reflect these pressures. Child-rearing becomes a high-cost, high-risk investment in advanced economies, discouraging fertility. In lower-income regions, children remain a form of social insurance, sustaining higher birth rates but limiting per-child investment. These divergent strategies reinforce global demographic asymmetry. Over time, inequality feeds back into demographics. Economic insecurity delays family formation. Wealth concentration reduces social mobility. Regions hollow out as young people migrate toward opportunity, leaving behind aging populations and declining tax bases. What appears as personal choice accumulates into structural constraint. Policy responses exist: progressive taxation, housing reform, education investment, and income supports, but they face political resistance in demographically polarized societies. Older voters prioritize stability and asset protection, while younger cohorts lack numerical or financial leverage. The result is an economy that functions, but unevenly. Growth continues in pockets. Innovation persists. Yet, cohesion weakens as households experience fundamentally different economic realities depending on age, skill, and location. In the final segment, we will step back to assess the long view, whether technology can fundamentally alter the demographic economic equation, or whether societies must learn to thrive within limits they can no longer escape. Demographics impose limits that no amount of short-term policy or technological optimism can fully erase. Populations age. Fertility shifts. Cohorts move through time with mathematical certainty. What societies can change is not the direction of these forces, but how gracefully or chaotically they adapt to them. The central economic transition of the coming decades is a shift from growth management to constraint management. In a world of stable or declining populations, traditional measures of success lose relevance. GDP growth becomes harder to achieve and less informative. Expansion gives way to optimization, maintaining living standards, preserving institutional capacity, and preventing inequality from destabilizing social systems. Technology plays a critical but bounded role. AI and automation can raise productivity, extend working lives, and reduce the labor intensity of essential services. They can help smaller populations support complex economies. But technology does not create demand on its own, nor does it automatically distribute its benefits. Without complementary institutions, productivity gains coexist with underemployment, fiscal strain, and social fragmentation. The societies most likely to succeed are those that realign expectations. Retirement becomes more flexible. Careers become nonlinear and lifelong. Education shifts from front-loaded to continuous. Care work, often undervalued, moves closer to the economic core as aging accelerates. Success is measured not by speed, but by durability. Globally, convergence slows. Some regions will remain youthful, but capital constrained. Others will be wealthy, but demographically brittle. Migration, trade, and digital connectivity link these worlds, but do not unify them. Economic power fragments into networks rather than hierarchies. This does not imply collapse. It implies a quieter future, one defined less by dramatic expansion and more by maintenance, adaptation, and selective innovation. The challenge is psychological as much as economic. Modern societies are built on expectation of progress as acceleration. Demographic reality demands a different narrative: progress as stability achieved under pressure. Technology can help write that story, but it cannot write it alone. Institutions, norms, and political systems must evolve at the same slow pace as the populations they serve. Where they do, prosperity becomes sustainable even without growth. Where they do not, demographic stress amplifies every existing fault line. The demographic era ahead will not reward those who chase scale for its own sake. It will reward those who understand limits early and design economies that can endure within them.